Entering its third year and still no prospect for a ceasefire in Ukraine. With much of the world initially condemning Russia for its invasion and offering robust support to Kiev, it seemed the underdog might triumph back in 2022. But 2 years later, support is waning while Moscow is making gains. So could 2024 finally bring both to the table to end this conflict? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the war in Ukraine. Well, most of the world was shocked when Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. There was even speculation that the dynamics it created could lead to a much wider war, not dissimilar to when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. But today, the conflict continues, and rather than drawing in neighbors, Ukraine's supporters seem to be backing away. Russia is now gaining territory, and sanctions to pressure the Kremlin have mostly failed. But will a third year of fighting bring more of the same, or might we see Moscow and Kiev sit down to negotiate? That debate in a minute, but first, a look at 2 years of war in Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin sent more than 200,000 fighters into Ukraine. It was a special military operation which was supposed to end in weeks. However, 2 years later, there is no clear end in sight.
I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years.
But Putin's soldiers met strong resistance, and the resilience of the Ukrainian people surprised Russia.
We will not lay down our weapons. We will defend our country. Our weapons are our strength. This is our land, our country, our children. We will protect all of them.
By the end of 2022, Ukraine had liberated half of its Russian-occupied territory, with 14% of the country remaining under Russian control. Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive has achieved initial gains, but the front lines have remained engaged for almost a year. Both sides have dug in, making breakthroughs increasingly difficult. And the number of military casualties has climbed to an estimated 500,000. Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian cities and has blockaded its ports. And Ukraine has stepped up drone attacks on Russian ships and infrastructure. Millions of people have been displaced since the start of the conflict, and the EU opened its borders to thousands fleeing the turmoil. The international response has been multifaceted, with billions in aid directed to Ukraine, while sanctions have been imposed in an attempt to isolate Russia. Since February 2022, Ukraine has received nearly $350 billion in aid, including $77 billion from the United States.
We will work to make sure Russia pays damages to Ukraine, and ultimately, we want to see Ukraine emerge from this war as a nation that is free, democratic, and independent. President Zelenskyy, as President Joe Biden and I have made clear, we will be with you for as long as it takes.
Global crop and food prices have been increasing since mid-2020, but Russia's attack on Ukraine has further driven up prices. Russia and Ukraine exports nearly a third of the world's wheat and barley, more than 70% of its sunflower oil, and are big suppliers of corn. Ukraine has seen a dramatic drop in its exports. This has resulted in major food security concerns for millions of people around the world. As Russia's attack on Ukraine enters its third year, the Ukrainian president is warning that much more aid is needed.
We can get our land back, and Putin can lose. And this has already happened more than once on the battlefield.
The scenarios for its outcome are still unclear, with neither side making substantial territorial gains in more than a year, there is much debate about whether the conflict has hit a stalemate and about who is to blame for Ukraine not being able to decisively repel the attack.
So what could this third year of conflict bring, and might we finally see an end to the fighting? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Kiev, Alexander Rodnyansky. He is an economic advisor to President Zelenskyy and assistant professor of economics at the University of Cambridge. From Moscow, Viacheslav Matuzov is a former Russian diplomat. And from London is former Moscow-based correspondent and the host of the podcast Backstory, Dana Lewis. Thanks all so much for being with me. Dana, I'll start with you as someone who's watched, every detail of this conflict as it has developed over the last 2 years. So where do you think this war stands now versus where you thought, or I should say hoped, it would 2 years ago?
Well, I won't inject my hopes in there because as a journalist, I really want to be, neutral on most of this, Andrea. But I would say that certainly it would appear that Ukraine was on the front foot, moving forward in the summer, trying to push back Russian positions. But as we come around to 2024, let's not kid ourselves. Ukraine is in trouble. In certain areas, it's lost Avdiivka. I think that you'll see more possible towns fall in the coming weeks. They are running low on ammunition. They are unable to move forward. At best, they can dig in. They are short on arms, short on people in the army. They've got to change their recruiting drive inside Ukraine, which has all sorts of political problems for Zelenskyy. And they need the U.S. Congress to approve that funding package so that they can re-equip their soldiers on the front line. They are outgunned 10-1, and they are, as I say, I think in deep trouble right now, and they acknowledge that themselves.
Yeah. Dana, before I move on, let me just ask you if you can identify perhaps a turning point or turning points that you saw over the last 2 years where you thought, oh, the tide is changing and Moscow is doing better than some had predicted.
I mean, look, Moscow, I don't want to overstate what they've done either. I mean, they may have lost some 300,000 soldiers, whether that be killed or wounded in action. One of the largest army in the world is controlling, 18% of Ukraine? And if you look at the front lines, you won't see that the lines have changed very much. So this is a major failure for Putin as well. But I mean, for Ukraine, everything is at stake. And Putin is showing no signs of willing to talk or to back down or to back up. And so I think Ukraine was successful in the first year doing what many thought they could never do, pushing Russian forces back. Last year, they were under a lot of pressure to show that they could move forward and take Russian positions and maybe push them out of the east. And this year, let's be realistic, everybody. They cannot move forward. They are digging in big defensive positions as we speak, and they're waiting for more aid. They've got to regroup, and they've got to resupply that army before we see more frontline areas begin to collapse.
Okay. Alexander, let me turn to you. You tell me, why is this war getting harder for Ukraine to fight? Is it mostly just a matter of weaponry from your allies to win it?
Well, that's one of the main reasons for sure. I mean, the delays that we are seeing among our allies, especially in the US, are certainly not helping. They're feeding a lot of the ammunition shortage that we're currently experiencing, and there's no secret around that. That's number one. Number two, this is a real war of attrition. Nobody said it was easy. We've had some prominent successes that were just mentioned by Dana over the last 2 years. That is true. But the Russians have also adapted, and we see them doing that with, unfortunately, some success. So look, we're in a war of attrition. It's grueling on both sides. The Russians have experienced extreme losses, very high losses. In fact, the Avdiivka retreat that we've currently seen just recently, that was really tactical on our end, but the Russian side has had terrible losses there. And if anything, you can only speak of a Pyrrhic victory, so a fake victory, in other words, where the losses are really outweighing any potential gains. So I wouldn't say we're close to any breakthrough on either side, unfortunately. What Ukraine certainly needs is more weaponry, more economic support. Remember, there's many dimensions to the war. There's not just the actual front line, the battlefield, there's also an economic front line. And we were hoping that sanctions pressure would be more effective. Unfortunately, it hasn't. And Russia has adopted to a lot of the sanctions imposed on them and the sanctions regime. And we have to actually take those, make those accountable who are helping Russia circumvent the sanctions regime. So in other words, look, there's many dimensions to the front line. This is a war of attrition. There's not going to be an easy solution or a quick solution here.
But Alexander, there's also the issue of your troops being depleted and needing more and even younger troops on the field. Dana had alluded to that. How are you doing in that sphere? Because we've been hearing reports, and you can tell us if you think they're exaggerated, of young Ukrainians actually leaving because they don't want to be sent to the front lines. They fear a draft. What are your forces saying now? Or do you feel that Ukrainians are as united as ever in fighting this war after 2 years?
If you look at the polls, and certainly all the main polls that are out there and the questions, if you ask them on the streets, you will see that Ukrainians are still fundamentally united among themselves in terms of the main objectives. Nobody wants to sacrifice any of our people, and that means any of our territories. Remember, territories is not just about land, it's about the people that are there, that are being killed, raped, abused, just losing their property, etc. Who knows what's going on there, what sort of war crimes have been imposed on them. We've seen what Russia does to them around Bucha in the north of Kiev. So we can't accept that. So if you ask the Ukrainian population, whether they are willing to compromise in any sense, you will find a consensus view that by no means. However, this is a war of attrition, as I said, and some of the facets that you've just described are real. Of course, nobody wants to die. Nobody wants to die in vain. I think that's true on either side, actually, no matter which conflict or war you look at. And that's certainly true for us. But I would say overall, morale is still high. The willingness to keep on fighting is still there. And there's still a lot of fight in Ukrainians, of course, because the stakes are just too high.
If I could jump in and say one thing which really struck me the other day, and that is the average age of Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, 43 years old. I was really struck by that. And they are going to have to recruit at least another quarter of a million soldiers, they say. So they've got to reduce the ages down, and they've got to get young people into the army.
Yeah. Drafts are never easy in any country, really, in almost any context. It's a very difficult institution, period. But let me move on to Vyacheslav, because Dana says this is also a failure for Putin, even if Russia is pulling ahead. But the truth is, winning a war of attrition may take a long time and it may be extremely painful, but in the end, it's still a win. Is that what you see for Russia?
Well, Russia, from the beginning of the military actions in the territories, proclaimed that she doesn't reject a political solution. And Russia proclaimed that she is ready to negotiate with Ukraine government, Ukraine administration. And in Istanbul, in April 22, 2 years ago, they agreed to and even Akhramiya, who is political counsel for Zelenskyy, signed the agreement and take it with him to show it to the high command, military and political command. And after that, we received an answer from Boris Johnson from London, not from Kiev. And after that, Mr. Blinken supported this stand Boris Johnson. He said, absolutely clear for Russian government, for Russian society. We are against any negotiations with Russia till it's full
capitulation,
conquer against Russia on the battlefield.
Yeah.
So I think that it is closed all opportunities for political solution after that.
Yeah, Vyacheslav.
And after Zelenskyy adopted a law prohibited any kind of negotiations with Russia, Ukrainian Russia. So battle continued. Battle continues. That's correct. That nowadays, these days, Russian army has a big success in Avdiivka, after Bakhmut, and many other places.
Ambassador, let me ask you though
it was
quickly.
not made any mobilization in Russia.
Understood.
No
you are not the first Russian panelist we've had that has said, just come to the table, we want to talk. But you've always said it's Ukraine that will not give in on territories that Russia feels it already claims the right to. The Western world sees it as occupation, but Crimea and Ukraine says those are no-goes for discussions, including Donbass. So, I'm sorry, just tell me, what would Russia settle for? If you did sit down at the table, what would be a fair outcome for Russia in negotiations?
I think that a Russian offer to negotiate to Ukrainian government lost opportunity because these points that were mentioned in media, world media, that what content of Russian offers to Ukrainian government is not now working. It is unacceptable about Crimea, about Donbass, because after that, Russia proclaimed 3 regions of Ukraine to be a part of Russian Federation. According to the Constitution, it is not discussable. Any person entering discussion with Ukraine on the future of these republics, they are considered traitors. And that's why I don't think that this subject can be under discussion.
Okay, so are you saying there was an opportunity to negotiate and now it's been lost and Russia is no longer willing to talk?
That's it. Because they considered that all those dissidents who traveled from Moscow to Israel and left Moscow because their protest against the war, it is minority. It is very small minority of Russian society. Putin catched and he enjoyed the stable position of majority of Russian society supporting him, especially today, when after 1 month we have presidential elections. And after that, it will be parliamentary elections. Putin got the majority of Russian society because Russian society, Putin pushed Putin to the more decisive decision, to more strong position, not be between the negotiations and between the war. They demand from him to finalize this conflict in victory only. That was the position of Putin as a head of the Russian state.
Okay, Dana, what did you disagree with there?
Under pressure.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in there, Andrea. But I mean, if you were to go back to the original suggestion that in Istanbul the Ukrainians signed a document, and that there was an agreement to end the war, and that Boris Johnson, tore it up and is to blame. The UK government says that's just pure fiction. Where's the signed agreement? Let's see it. What was signed by who? What kind of agreement was this? I mean, the Ukrainians say the only thing that Moscow is seeking is surrender and destruction of the Ukrainian state. President Putin says in his own interviews that he doesn't recognize the Ukrainian state anymore. So what is supposed to be agreed upon? And then we roll into this election talk. What elections are taking place in Russia? I mean, guys, get real. There is no democracy in Russia. It is a charade, and I've covered it many times. They are fixed ballots, and President Putin will cruise to victory. I mean, let's just give him 75% now or 80%, because that's what they give him every time. That is not a mandate for the continuation of war. And anybody that comes out and speaks against the war is arrested and thrown in jail or murdered, like Alexei Navalny.
Alexander, let me turn to you. I mean, if there is any potential for resolution here, Is the Ukrainian position the same today as it was very steadfastly 2 years ago, that there was no compromise, there was no talk about Crimea, there was no talk about ceding any of the Donbass? Is that still where Ukraine stands?
Well, look, first of all, I just want to echo what Dana just said. I mean, there's a lot in what we just heard, and it's contradictory in and of itself. It's Russia apparently who was willing to talk, but then you just heard that they're not willing to talk, in fact, and that the opportunities have passed. But even if they were willing to talk, in order to answer your question, let me just say this hypothetically. How can we trust this side? Remember, we're dealing with someone who, with a country that was claiming, vehemently denying any sort of aggression plans just days before it happened. There was all Western hysteria, apparently, when we spoke about an imminent attack, an invasion 2 years ago, right? Remember, this is a side that claimed that it never occupied Crimea at the beginning, 10 years ago, that it was all some green men that they weren't responsible for, etc., etc. So the trustworthiness of Russia as a partner is really an issue here, no matter whether you look back or you look forward. Now, in terms of Ukraine's priorities, look, we have internationally recognized borders by the whole civilized world, and in fact, by certain countries, most countries, that are now either trying to be neutral or even supporting Russia one way or another. Now, these borders need to be respected. We're not going to let a dictator destroy the international post-World War II peace order, because just imagine what the repercussions will be, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe and globally, in light of all the crisis region and the hotspots that you see around the world right now. Now, this is really in the interest of not just Ukraine, but the whole entire civilized world, I would claim. And
yeah,
that's
Alexander,
why
I mean, Ukraine has said that since the beginning, and to be fair, so did your supporters. But now you're seeing that position change. Too many people don't think it's in the interest, especially there's quite an elite group of mostly Republicans in the United States that are trying very hard to pull back their support. So what do you think, where does that leave you?
They're not an elite group of Republicans.
Well,
they are a fringe group of Republicans, and pretty extreme at that. And most of the Republicans, Andrea, in fact, do support the ongoing support of Ukraine. And
I'm not sure, Dana. I mean, if you listen to,
this bill may get passed in March.
I just heard Trump on Fox News the other day, and a like open discussion with a wide audience that all agreed that that's where the United States should go. It's not America's problem. And Trump may very well win the next election. So, yeah, it's quite possible. So you can say it's a marginalized group, but it is I would argue it's a pretty strong opinion on the right and rather influential right now. So, Alexander, I mean, I was asking, where do you think that will leave? If the West withdraws its support and Ukraine is left to its own devices and struggling in this war, where does that leave the rest of the world?
Well, clearly this is a serious issue for us. We will be in a perilous state. But I would also say, look, first of all, I will not comment on what the Republicans are doing. They're playing with fire. History will judge them. That's clear. When it comes to Ukraine, there's also some other news that are positive, right? The European Union has just passed a package of 50 billion euros for a 4-year program that reduces a lot of the uncertainty, both economic and in terms of military support for us going forward. Now, that's number one. We are obviously waiting for the US to chip in. That's true. But we are also diversifying a lot of what we're doing. We're building up our own production systems, our own military capacities in order to become less reliant on the West more generally. And this takes time, unfortunately, but we are working on alternative scenarios. Let me just answer this very clearly. Even if there's going to be trouble with some of the aid coming in, Ukraine will not just give up. Ukraine is not going anywhere. And in fact, the front lines are not even changing now that much. And we will keep on moving and pushing and defending our borders, defending our international sovereignty for as long as it takes.
And let me ask Viacheslav, I know you didn't have sound for the last couple minutes, unfortunately, but just your final thoughts then on where you think this will go in its now 3rd year that's just beginning. And we know today that the United States has approved a number of additional sanctions on Russia over the murder of Alexei Navalny, or what they presume is the murder of Alexei Navalny. Does it matter? Will the Kremlin feel the pressure at all to change that position you were talking about and perhaps come to the negotiating table to end this sometime in the year ahead?
Well, I think that the final decision, final end of all this will be content of Russian offers to Ukrainian government in April 22. What was contained, this offer? It contained the main thing that Ukraine cannot be anti-Russian base for any military equipment or military actions from the name of NATO organization of the United States.
Okay. NATO's still an issue. Okay, Vyacheslav, unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we are over time for this edition of The Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank really all three of my panelists so much for being with me. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.